Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Intel World Open in Tokyo. Oh, wait, no. Welcome to another mishmashing Battle Lounge with the 2NK team. Today we are starting out with an idea that can get you further in fighting games, but isn't really common to beginners, so we're doing, I wouldn't say it's advanced strategy or tactics, it's mindsets again. That seems to be mostly what we talk about these days. And the strategy and tactics come in if there's any specific players that show up to teach us anything. This looks probably like it'll be fun today. This Ryu seems to be not necessarily aggressive, but despite spending a lot of time walking backward, which is we're probably used to by now and teams probably trained pretty well on it, they're not actually like running away. So it seems so far. No, they've got a fairly good idea of what they want to happen here. Looks like they're setting up some cool Ryu whiff punishes, which is actually pretty helpful in this matchup. So, today we're talking about, let's call it authority, as it is in the system setup. And authority in this case refers to when you are definitely better at something than either most people you know or your opponent, and can make use of it in different ways. This player, for example, seems to be an authority on making you want to do things, which will then be relatively punishable, and you can do this with most characters. Footsie characters in general are quite good at it, but honestly, while it's not really obvious, Ryu is one of the better characters at this in the game. Ryu's footsie game is only slightly worse than Juri's, and that's actually debatable now that he's gotten very slight buffs. Can he beat you up quickly? Not the same way you could before, but if you're good enough at fundamentals, you didn't really need to use Ryu's meter for pretty much anything, putting him similarly back to where he was to begin with. Back in Season 1, Ryu was devastatingly effective because he really just didn't need to use his meter and therefore could always be ready to hit you with his super. He also did slightly more damage in almost every situation, and of course that made this moment not happen. Karin would already be down. But you can easily see it here. Until or unless Kan's Dynasty either calms down or shifts the way she wants to play the matchup, this is probably going to keep happening in the exact way it's happening. And as you can see, as soon as they realize, oh, you've switched to defense mode, they're coming in. So, really, so far, that was just them, their fireball not coming out right, or their forward heavy punch not coming out right. So we definitely have an authority today. Which is good, because, honestly, Ryu is a character that, even since the buff, we haven't had a really strong Ryu that wasn't just overwhelming in every way and probably retreating all the time. Like, that was obvious. That was an exact setup for, I'm going to make you want to Rasenha, and I'm going to make your Rasenha miss. Understanding what your opponent has authority on is how you work on developing your strategy for them, whatever that may be. So, when you don't have your spotter available, or the spotter only has enough time to tell you something, that's usually what they'll be communicating to you. It's sometimes the reason you're losing, but if you're winning, your spotter may still have something to say. If you're winning, the spotter may tell you, this is how they have been getting close to winning, this is what they seem to be trying to do, this is what they seem to be good at. And if you are even slightly susceptible to that, but are, winning in other interactions, you should assume that your opponent is probably going to adapt around you, and the match is going to get harder as you go. At least, if you keep doing the same thing. So even if you are winning, you often have to adapt to stay ahead of your opponent instead of just hoping you get to keep being there, because you've played the game enough to know that when you adapt, you can make big changes to your outcomes. So obviously your opponent can too. But no, this player is definitely not the I am going to exclusively retreat, and they're definitely not the I'm just going to just come in at you full power and do exactly the same thing. So you're going to have to be careful here. So again, we're countering you as the authority on making you do things and then mess up, even if those things are better forced from really close. This is actually a good challenge for Amara as well, because her style of play involves doing a lot of things and using the ability to power through those things as the main method of gaining advantage. Some opponents fall into this, and some really don't, as just demonstrated. When your opponent is constantly in a state of expecting you to do things, the only thing you really can get away with is either relaxedly doing nothing for a while, which often doesn't work because you get thrown in various ways, or you learn some of what can be done to make your opponent think you've done thing A when you really haven't, or you do something that could be blocked, that would be defended often enough, and then fit in that whole, okay, this time though I'm doing it the messed up way. Abigail, unfortunately, is not very great at this. You always have to take some small risk in order to get these things done. Still, you'll notice, for example, that the standard Abigail footsie buttons aren't happening here, because this player has already demonstrated they're a whiff punish player. They're a setup of mid-range situations type of player. Just throwing out buttons in neutral is either going to do nothing or get them punished in some way. See? So it's actually better that she's relying on things like the crouch heavy kick, or rather the roll. The crouch heavy kick might also do the job. Things like overhead, and the somewhat unconventional full run. You gotta know what your character can and cannot power through.
Abigail wins.
But it's exactly that knowledge that a Ryu player is most likely going to take to heart now. Because a lot of the time, they're solving a situation using the fireball, or I can probably just tell you with some authority myself that they're thinking about it. They're thinking about how to use the fireball to solve problems in specific spaces. And there's the Tatsu. I was just about to get to it. The Tatsu is the easier solution to this problem, while not really changing the amount of damage Ryu takes. This is not to say that it's a safe idea, or particularly great to go for in terms of, well, I'm just gonna land this a lot and be fine. But, compared to other options, this could lead to a lot of good things. EX Tatsu in particular, while Abigail can punish it a little bit, is not really that weak as an option here. Abigail has to punish one very specific way, it's not very damaging, and it shuts down a lot of Abigail's approaches, so I'm not sure we're going to see it, but if I were advising them, that's what I'd be telling them. If I only had time to tell them one tiny thing between these rounds, technically that's how it is right now, that'd be what I'd say. Watch for your EX Tatsu opportunities. Because sometimes you just want your opponent off you and you can't be sure that what you do otherwise is going to be a good idea in any form. Empty jump low.
Abigail wins. Let's do this.
See if I think all this have a low frame rate actually. I'm not sure, but I seem to remember that they're a little stuttery regardless of what you're doing. Going back to talking now. We were actually going to have Mishmashing Lounge, but there weren't a lot of great lounges, and people have been showing up to... We were actually going to have Mix and Mash Lounge. Mishmashing people have been showing up, showing us stuff, giving us things to either talk about or experience. We're changing our stream schedule a bit coming up, for various reasons, but you're still probably going to get your Street Fighter. Sometimes, therefore, you get to see moments like this. Amara's general known power is knowing when to power through things. When to ignore enemies using certain tactics, because Abigail is one of the few characters where you just can't use your tactic repeatedly. Eventually you will get armored through, you will get parried, something will happen. So you have to be constantly adapting really quickly. And when you do overwhelm Abigail, it's usually because less meter was used, which means you have to worry about it in the next round. So it's not exactly like you've come out on top in those situations a lot of times. Abigail's main problem in this matchup actually is that there's a lot of variability in when one needs to hit defensive attacks. Specifically, like, back heavy punch tends to miss, crouch light punch does better but doesn't do much damage. It's similar to the Jury matchup where the EX Abigail punch does a lot of work, but the spaces in which you get to do what you want are greatly reduced compared to most. Fortunately, Abigail can make up for this with range, and because Necalli has to spend so much time pretty much preemptively hitting buttons to stop Abigail from doing things, at least some of this gets to come out in the actual play. And as mentioned before, if you win round 1 against an Abigail because they didn't use enough meter to stop you, you probably shouldn't really feel all that great about it, because you still have to deal with that. And as demonstrated, EX Abigail punch is quite long. This is not a really often used tactic, because at the highest levels people are aware that Abigail can do this, and won't necessarily stick out as many preemptive buttons in the first place. So it's a good suppressive tactic for when you're trying to just walk up on someone, or just get them to stop hitting so many buttons in neutral if they have long range buttons to hit.
Fight.
Necalli's best options in this matchup therefore often involve hitting Stomp at the right timings, the dive kick, which we've mentioned many times, and the other V trigger, honestly. Although it is not necessarily impossible to use this one, it's that this situation where one is trying to play offensively really doesn't work a lot against someone who understands so much about how to power through things. Getting the crawling beast out helps somewhat, but if you just want mechanically the best V-trigger to use, you use the V-trigger one, because while Abigail can power through the Seismo as we call it, it's a very different game to do so. You are seeing the thing that's mostly saving, the forward jump. I believe Necalli's is with light kick, but I'm not sure. Oh, that was a good late parry. This match is very dynamic. It changes in what players are trying to do, what they need to look out for, and so on constantly. So it's actually a really good mental exercise to play it in this form. So while it isn't optimal for winning it, if you're not really trying to win it, you might as well do this, because while you can change your V trigger before every single match that this game allows for, it helps if you're able to shift things if you forget. I think we know this, Ed. But it's always hard to remember who was haha, I'm the best teabag, and then some usually lose, and who was literally, again, an authority. So we'll see. I guess I'll know better whether or not they actually play Ed. Because the last Ed I remember was basically just an Ed. The last Ed I remember being particularly threatening, that is. Okay, can't say for sure. But this is another shift. Abigail can't really power through Ryu in the same way most of the time. It's a matter of walking forward very slowly while waiting for Ryu to do one of 5 things. You get a lot of freedom in this match as Ryu. What you don't get is a lot of guaranteed successes.
Round 1.
Abigail can try to make a read on what Ryu's likely to do based on range, and it's really effective whenever those things go right. So as Ryu, if you've ever played a rock, paper, scissors game, especially one of those really weird special ones, where they're actually trying to make it somehow more interesting, it's usually found as a subcomponent to some other, like, little mini flash game or something, where they give you the options, and then they actually make rock, paper, and scissors themselves have different, like, outputs. It's slightly more interesting, but it's a matter of you learn the opponent, you learn a couple mind games, and it works out. Amara's pretty good at the mind games part of this. And in that case, you see, well, basically just a missed parry. Ah, they didn't go for the hit, and therefore, not a hit. But overall, that's what we're seeing here. Ryu gets a lot of freedom, but also takes a lot of damage. And Abigail has at least one really good option that deals decent damage, another probably less effective in terms of how often it works option that does more damage, and then the crazy stuff which does tons of damage. As the Ryu player, therefore, you have to decide what your style is going to reward you for. Like, are you the sort of person who wants to jump and face the decent damage option? Because you can absolutely try empty jumping, but then you won't get much damage. Some people can actually get the opponent to do it differently and get their damage, but all in all, you're generally not getting a lot out of it. The dash throw is another good option. It helps to be very frustrating, but if your opponent learns to counter the dash throw in any form, you tend to lose out on the feelings that go with it. Really good ending there. It's among the best possible plans to have at that moment. And a good choice to break out in that particular way too. Because now, it's a little bit easier. Now you could rely on dash throw, because you don't really need to do a ton of damage. When you have the life lead as Ryu, it's much more likely that doing dash up throws and similar is a good idea, because the opponent has to watch the ground when you dash, and it might distract them from the jump, as just seen.
You win.
So we see a really good rapid adaptation here. But Abigail has answers to this too. Just forward heavy punch is usually enough to solve this whole style, mainly because the flow in which Ryu is dashing, the forward heavy punch will resolve the problem. Now, whether or not you actually get to do this is complicated, because you have to, again, believe that your opponent's goal is not what it looks like. Or, in this case, because the round start would have been there, just not care. The opponent can dash and throw like 5 times before Abigail cares at all, whereas they'll be even like 2 jumps. So expecting that the dash and the footsies and so on is going to be an anti-air situation involving the forward heavy punch is a lot more likely. Unfortunately, once Ryu gets to a certain point, the forward heavy punch kind of doesn't work anymore. You have to more so do a read on it.
Ryu wins.
One useful thing for Abigail in this matchup is that Ryu's ability to do pressure that Abigail can't parry or armor out of is a bit lower than most characters, so you could manage to stop at the point of pressure, but that does not necessarily mean it's going to be enough.
Let's do this.
So we saw the Ryu player begin with a lot of, I'm going to throw fireballs, I'm going to play footsies, I'm going to set up to whiff punish you, and change that based on the fact that it was basically incredibly ineffective. They changed to getting into good positions for their jumps, putting extra pressure on mentally with dash throw option, which never had to be used. They didn't dash throw really, they dashed through a little bit at the beginning to establish this as this is gonna happen sometimes, and make the opponent think about it. And then from there, it's just a matter of how good can I jump? How well can I mess up your expectations when I jump? And they spent a whole round or so learning that too, because they got parried repeatedly for jumping. And probably spent most of those rounds trying to figure out the range at which they could get away with it. That would probably be a really interesting match to keep on seeing. In a 1st to 10 situation, I expect it would swing back, as our Abigail learned to do the rest of it. Unfortunately, our Karin has much bigger problems with doing this precise sort of thing. so it may not be as necessary for them to figure out where to go from the beginning. I think we reviewed this before, where Karin often has to seppo out of Meoken under just dash forward out of mid-screen situations where the opponent is likely to jump, but other options won't easily work. Unfortunately, Ed can actually manage to do something about this, because normally it's Ken that you're doing this for, because Ken's jump and movement will cause him to just not hit. But this tactic is good against more than just Ken, just not as good. She also can parry out of opposing strings after 1 or 2 blocks, and Ed isn't very effective at tick throws actually. While he can definitely do them, and you can convince him to do them, they're blatant because he can't easily, because of pushback indications, he can't easily hit like light punch and then medium punch and then medium punch again and do things that actually matter. So you can get out of a lot of situations. Basically, if you are even slightly used to it, Ed tends to like telegraph things he's going to do on pressure. Really fascinating.
Round 2. Fight.
This is again the usual problem. And unfortunately, it's hard to see it because of what happens in the matchups. This is a situation of, and you've just seen probably the remedy to it, Karin standing her ground too much, blocking through everything, not looking to get good positions by backdashing, etc., leading to her being stuck in constantly shifting situations that don't benefit. However, this is hard to see when your opponent almost instantly gets you to the corner because you didn't do it at the beginning of the round. It's easier to make Ed miss things on a character like Karin, who has good walk speed, who could get back into position quickly, who has outright attacks, long range with punish style attacks she can use if you mess up something or go for the wrong jump, or so on. But if you don't want to do this, if you want to get to stand in your spot, it gets really hard to pull your opponent into that rhythm and get them to do anything else.
Let's do this. Round 1. Fight! Hadouken! Hadouken!
Well, the matchup of these two is definitely a strong indication of things, and I don't actually expect it to be very swingy. I should thank them for their color choices though, because I can talk about the silver Ryu and the gold Ryu and it probably be correct? Yes, it's correct. Okay, let's go then. My tendency to not give the name of a player unless they, like when you can tell that a player really obviously wanted you to call their name out, I'll do it. But sometimes you can't be sure of that. In this case, it looks kind of like it. I could see these people wanting to specifically be known as Tonlock and Tayani. But sometimes that's not why the name was used, and therefore I get this tendency, basically because of going to tournaments or stuff like that, just hanging out in Discord chats, of not using the name unless the person tells you to do that.
You win.
And since it doesn't tend to do any harm to streams for me to be doing it that way, as long as I have any other distinguisher, and I'm not really talking about people between rounds, I'll probably default to do it. So our Silver Ryu specializes in making people miss, or shifting their offensive play such that whiff punishes can happen. Even little things like that light punch. They're looking for creating a space where they get to do things. And our Gold Ryu has a specific concept of, alright, I know my ranges on offense, I know how to... It's a skill we call multi-threat. To get to a spot where you have a ton of different options that your opponent must respond to in different ways, and they know this. The important thing is that if you haven't convinced them that they have to care, then they'll just always counter your most damaging option, or the one you use the most. You can absolutely use this to your advantage, but in a mirror match this might get dicey. Not this time though. This is a really important skill. This is a skill that is also extremely discouraging to try to actually build up, because it won't necessarily get you very far. The good part about it is that, from my experience so far, you can train it at nearly any level, because you're not really doing that much. The opponent is punishing you when you make mistakes in manipulating them, and you just get hurt whenever you don't play well enough in terms of that. Looks like our Miryu is gone, and we are now left with our Ed Ryu. But since this is the one that plays in the style I'm talking about, I'll continue. Being able to get the opponent to think they can punish you, to think they can get into position, to think they can do something, and fail, relies on you being willing to try this over and over, and take usually a lot of damage while you're learning to do it. It also requires a lot more matchup knowledge and character knowledge to put as a baseline for your player knowledge to get you even further. It can be a rough run, but some people find it enjoyable enough to make those sacrifices and push forward, regardless of it. Now this is interesting because it's a good choice. Both Ed and Ryu, their multi-threat goes away against Necalli. It's not that they can't deal with Necalli. In fact, they deal with Necalli fairly well, but this player's style, as it's been shown to us so far, might not work out that well for it.
Round one, fight.
So they changed to a character that actually has a closer range multi-threat. Or technically, you could say that Claw has multi-threat active literally all of the time, because there's no way to make Claw not do certain things. There's only the ability to counter them. And we can already see more of this. If this player was the one talking and giving lectures on what they're doing, I'm fairly sure it would be relatively involved. This is one player where I can definitely say they are thinking about a lot of things, or have trained themselves to the point where, nope, I know what I'm doing here. Unfortunately, I didn't catch how the high level they are on this character, but it's definitely a lot of the same thing. If you could tell me what you thought this player was going to do in any given moment, I'd be very impressed. Now, this isn't to say that you can't fight them, because a lot of what they do isn't necessarily that threatening unless you are thinking you must do something about it.
Vega wins.
A lot of the time, against this sort of player, as much as it frustrates me because I am this sort of player, you can just keep blocking. Because nearly none of these strings or similar lead to a really good position to just throw people.
Round one. Fight.
People who have good enough throw defenses will almost always tech out. And people who are very buttonsy, who keep on managing to get through it, they usually manage to reduce it down to, should I block or should I hit like a button to check a throw? And it's decent to bring it down to that. However, it does give players like me, players like this Claw, a lot of agency once we get the life lead, because we kind of don't have to do anything anymore.
Round two. Fight.
At least with Chun-Li and Karin, you don't have the worry about not being able to deal with their jump as much. Claw is a different matter, you have to worry about the jump a lot. Because the character doesn't care as much if you move during the jump. He'll normally have some answer to this regardless. And discouraging him from doing the things he wants is really hard. I wasn't expecting that to fail, but I can tell you that that super has been on their mind for some time, because they were probably trying to catch
Vega wins.
DWuulfe's air movement or jumps with it. Always being slightly behind. Probably seem to have the discipline to not hit the button and therefore miss with the super. I'm not sure it can miss in the way I'm thinking of though, so. It can, however, be late enough for the opponent to somehow land or slide under it or something and it'd be a problem. This clash is probably going to be very interesting to see, regardless of what character Tonelot plays. This is because it's fairly easy to get JustVine to respond to things incorrectly, but it's very hard to do damage to Bison or Armika if that's what happens. Rose is similar, so it doesn't really matter. She can play any of those three characters. If she plays someone else, it might be more useful to the opponent. But any of those three, you can absolutely cause them to miss, but because of the way they flow, there's much less benefit to doing so. Since you have to launch almost all your attacks from further away, so as not to deal with things like Psycho Inferno, EX Psycho Inferno, Head Stomp if you gave too much time to prepare, Bison just straight up dashing, the long range on Psycho Burst. Bison has lots of options to make sure you can't do certain things. And that makes Ed probably the best choice here, yeah. Ed has a really good jump for this sort of thing. A really good dash and bat dash for this. And can switch to doing moves that give entirely larger, unexpected options. And of course it doesn't hurt to be able to just, hey, I'm gonna hit you with my ES uppercut from this far away. Because Bison's crush counters, the really good ones that lead to big damage, are close range, and it is entirely possible for Ed to actually not be in that range at the end of Ed does in fact get pressure after Psycho Upper, to the point where if one could manage to get yourself to not wake up with quick rise or back rise, you'd probably be better off. You just like let him, you just stay down and let him get you. But it does depend. There are times where it matters and times where it doesn't. You see a difference here where JustVine tends to be ready for them to hit 2 buttons and then jump, for example.
Final round.
Mostly by familiarity with both this character and people who play like this. Unfortunately, Bison doesn't have a lot of really great answers to this happening. Good V-shift. Bison gets very little damage off this, so there's really no good reason for Ed to not just keep that up. Psycho Inferno could help, but even that is still not really all that threatening. However, there is one way to make the situation really bad for the Ed player. And this is again where the sort of thing you use for strategy comes in. If you realize, okay, this situation keeps on happening, and I need to stop them from doing this specific thing, because I'm not getting enough damage this way. One thing you are getting is meter, very slowly, but you're getting meter and they are getting only approximately the same amount. But you get to play a lot of neutral when you do it, and if you can get enough neutral and meter, eventually Bison will have super. And you can go from, okay, I've jumped back and done light punch a couple times, to I'm just going to super you because I don't care. My super doesn't care if you land on the other side, but you're going to die either way.
Round 2. Fight.
So it's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. Do I need this meter for this matchup? Or is the main thing that I'm facing danger from here something I don't care about in that regard? Bison faces the usual problems dealing with Flicker. And a long jump.
Final round. Fight.
Not sure if that was intentional, because now that strategy has, of course, been weakened by the use of the meter. But it's not necessarily that JustVine was using that strategy to begin with. It's just notable that it's gone now. No, never intended to use that strategy for this. But of course it turns out the way you'd expect. With no discouragement from jumping, Ed jumps and succeeds at jumping, and then that's the match.
Ed wins.
This can be hard to adapt to when you're just fresh getting out of the silver ranks, when you've gotten the physical skill to deal with most situations, and you're dealing with gold players who appear to be doing the same thing, but aren't. But I guess since they have decided they had enough, we're moving on to intra-team combat, and I'll have less to say now.
Abigail! Round 1. Round 2. Fight! You lose. Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! You lose. Let's do this. Round 1. Abigail wins. Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! Abigail wins.
Part of the reason we use such specific labels for things, even though it can be confusing to a listener who isn't familiar with them, is actually because when you are in a situation where you have a team effort, we're all rowing together, but the spotter of whoever doesn't have a lot of time to tell you things, again, like someone watching you play online, there may not be enough time between matches. There's very, very little time between matches online. You don't know if your opponent's lagging out, you don't know if technically you're lagging out. You basically, if you're willing to take the match, you hit retry and you're basically back in immediately. Which means you want the minimum amount of time required to convey some specific concept. And part of the reason for this stream and this term is actually to help explain that. Because if you tell someone between matches your style isn't working, this can be really discouraging. So you need a way to distinguish what you mean. It is impossible sometimes to say your style will always work because of various little things. It could be with your execution that day, it could be with the matchup, it could be just you're not able to learn anything given the strength of your opponent. But when you say style work, styles technically, if the player is managing them, always work. Because if you are, like us, people who play this game primarily for fun, the only way your style doesn't work is if it's actively causing you to have less fun somehow, which generally should pretty much never be true. You're playing the wrong game if that's the case. And we're pretty sure right now that we're not playing the wrong game here. But what can fail is your authority. your opponent could either counter it so hard that your authority doesn't matter at all, or it puts you at risk often enough in a matchup that you have to think about just threatening it and not actually using it. Which is why the terms are different. Your style is, hey, I like to move with this thing, I like to power through stuff, I like to play offensively, I like to make my opponent think about these things. If your opponent is either personally really good at stopping you, or their character in some way counters what you're doing, or their authority counters what you're doing, then that's a real thing that has to be communicated fairly fast. Your authority isn't
Abigail
working.
wins.
The thing you are usually good at, the thing that you have built up skills for and rely on, isn't the way to go to get success in the matchup. This is not to say usually that you should discard it entirely, because it's hard to give up those things. It's not usually even a good idea to just stop using the thing you're an authority on. But you do have to distract your opponent from it for a while first to give you the opening to use it. And this is honestly a pretty good example, because Abigail's authority, or at least Amara's Abigail's authority, doesn't really work on Bison. Bison can attack from too far away, jumps in, messes up in various weird situations, and because of various things related to timing, isn't very susceptible to Abigail armoring through stuff. Not to mention being able to be reversal out of a ton of weird situations. And do stuff like that, where it's just, okay, yeah, I know that you have options, but I don't care about them, I have neither. Thankfully, Abigail has a lot of power to deal with things here. But really, a lot of it doesn't work. Even crouch medium kick, for example, won't do that much. And stand heavy kick, while it is probably among the better options in the matchup, nearly never leads to actual damage. It's just hard to whiff punish and gets you forward a little faster without having to deal with all of Bison's options. We're used to thinking of buttons as things that are supposed to hit the opponent, most of us, when playing at the lower levels, but sometimes you just need them to help you move forward. Similarly, Abigail benefits quite a bit from using V-reversal because Bison usually can't set up a situation in which he gets to bait a V-reversal and still keep the oppressive pressure going. Which is technically why we call what Bison does oppression instead of pressure. A pressure character can switch to a throw fairly quickly. An oppression character usually is not in range to do this. And you can just block basically forever, with their main advantage being they're usually better in neutral, so that you take a lot of white health damage, they just go, okay, I guess you blocked that entire sequence, and then they move on and continue the same way. They just do it again until you're finally too frustrated, try to mash out of the oppression string and die.
And Bison wins.
Abigail faces a couple of relatively good options here though, because just using the run, especially holding the startup of the run, causes Bison to stutter and stagger, and that means that Bison's charge moves disappear. Basically, you have enough time upon starting the run to see if your opponent is crouch blocking. If they are, you get to do one set of things, and if they're not, you get to do a different set of things. Similarly, just using reverse out of it can cause Bison to end up in bad situations, because if the Bison player comes forward at all, most likely Abigail has more solutions than before. But unfortunately, Bison's specific methods of the jump make it quite hard to get damage off of the actual run. So it's another situation. Your authority doesn't quite work here. That's a 2-hit, and I think it normally works like that. The Bison will fail the parry. One of the main things that is difficult to deal with, and generally to remember, is that when an oppressive character is fighting you in this way, particularly Bison because of the rhythm he has to do things at, you can usually parry out of the strings. Now, when you are red, when your opponent realizes you're going to parry out of the string and stops doing it, you will take crush counter level damage. So you don't necessarily want to parry out of the string too often, but if your opponent has become too comfortable with the whole, okay, I just get to hit buttons forever, you have to respect it, you can spend that time learning the parry strings, which is something that probably those two players are going to end up doing at some point in the future when we have less on our plates as a whole. It is a little harder to practice it against someone who will rapidly adapt around you doing the parry, but it is also decent training in terms of getting used to the idea that you can't parry often, so it still kind of works. Our Karin has changed to Sakura on the principle of not feeling like moving much today.
Round 1.
Or rather, feeling like not having to move. Sakura can whiff punish from much further away than Karin with much less risk. She can do Tatsu, which is basically the thing that's been... The good reason to switch to Sakura here is that she just wanted to Tatsu to death. Pretty much it. Hit buttons, backdash, sometimes jump, Tatsu. So you can see the immediate change in feeling flow going here. Now, that doesn't really mean that the matches are going to go a ton better, because you still have to worry about, let's call it, authority. Fortunately, Bison doesn't deal with Sakura's ranges that well.
Round 2. Fight.
The perfect scissor kick spacing for Sakura is weird. I think you have to use medium to get the perfect spacing. She has a bunch of counters to things at close range. And you have to be fairly oppressive. Fortunately, she doesn't really have a problem with this. So from the Sakura side, it's just, do I feel like uppercutting?
Final round. Fight.
And it doesn't even have to be ES uppercut either, which is one of the largest problems Bison faces. Medium uppercut will generally cover the space between her and other things Bison does. But since the move isn't actually a counter hit state, you can't be crush countered for doing it. I'm not saying this is a great idea as a generality, but you can catch a lot of Bison stuff with just medium uppercut. Both the air things and the I just don't feel like dealing with any more of your oppression tend to work out pretty well. This will cause your opponent to block more, which means that they are likely to get either forced into blocking Tatsu, or you just dash and throw them.
You lose.
Leading us to a situation very similar to the Ryu from earlier in the stream. Sakura achieves multi-threat by adding a move that doesn't necessarily give much benefit. Like, the only thing you're getting out of adding this running medium punch uppercut to your option set is your opponent thinks differently. And this is super important to you. You've created multi-threat by doing it. You get to jump, you get to throw Hadoukens, you get to do more Tatsus, you can do your like overhead. So you started from before of, I don't really get to do much of anything, to, I have all my options again, because I showed willingness to do this move that you probably would never expect me to use. It's not a great option most of the time, but it is in there, and if you keep on defending the way you're defending, I might get to use it. You have to understand that a lot of this game is about convincing your opponent to stop blocking long enough for you to do something. And sometimes you have to show a specific vulnerability so that your opponent thinks, okay, I probably can get away with this, I don't have to block, they're likely to make this mistake, or they're likely to do this thing, or I should be in this different situation or position because it's not a great idea. But it can be hard to keep in mind why exactly you're doing it, and that can cause you to lose matches. The medium uppercut, for example, is here to make Bison block more, so that you can do your other stuff. But that's kind of the point. If Bison, if it's working, you should actually expect your opponent to block it more often. You use it when your opponent doesn't block, and them not blocking is causing you problems. Note what I said, because sometimes your opponent isn't blocking, but because you messed with so much of the ranges, they're not causing you problems anymore, so you don't care. That, though, was basically a decent trade-off. There was a certain amount of damage taken. The opponent had little meter to do anything with it. I'm not even sure JustVine had, like, meter to convert from yet, and it wouldn't have mattered that much if she did, like, V-meter. But here we have the result. A Bison that blocks a lot compared to before. Because you've indicated, no, I don't, I'm reminding you here that I don't have to play footsies. I can literally just run at you and try to punch you. And other players will do this to you all the time. Some people will just outright refuse to play footsies because you keep on winning in footsies, and they're reminding you, I don't actually have to do that. I don't have to play footsies to beat you.
Round one. Fight.
And if you don't adapt to this fact, then sometimes you will be in a lot of trouble. It also limits Bison's ability to safely be oppressive, with much the same result. I don't have to deal with you printing tons of buttons. Eventually you'll push yourself out, and then I can uppercut, and then things will happen. Now, of course, as noted, your opponent will eventually start to expect this, but that's what you wanted. You wanted them to stop doing the thing that was stressing you out. And I believe it was the last stream on which I had anything to say where we discussed this in fair amounts of detail. How to learn to balance this. How to learn how often to actually do the uppercut versus just threatening the uppercut. And it's very, very opponent dependent. Some people are really hard to discourage and you have to uppercut a lot, because they'll go, you're not doing much damage to me, I don't care. You're doing something risky, I'll eventually kill you, because you're poking me and I'm not getting hurt that bad. However, there's this, which kind of changes the situation somewhat. But overall, JustVine could take that approach of, yeah, no, I don't actually care, I do way more damage than you, I'm just not gonna bother. I think that was a fireball. But you see that the match does slow down to probably where Kansas Dynasty wanted it. Instead of having to deal with all of Bison's stuff, you're reasonably sure Bison will not do certain things in neutral, and things got to change around quite a bit.
Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
I believe I've now done the rotation through all the intra-team matchups. And therefore probably I'm done until the lounge closes up or someone shows up, and that's unlikely. Even with only 4 players and the potential for people to drop back, I doubt we're going to get a long set with any non-team members tonight. That said though, if you are interested in the concepts given so far and seeing how players adapt to knowing some of them, especially since, you know, this is our practice time, we don't really play this game much outside of here against each other.
Round two. Fight!
This specifically is the in-team practice time that we often get, which is why we did end up doing Mash Fashion today instead of Mix and Mash. So, despite me not having much more to say, and probably being silent for the next, let's call it, half hour before the stream ends, we are going to keep on streaming for that half hour, probably. And you can, if you're watching on YouTube, for example, and you're a person who does this sort of thing as a study, if you don't remember things I said, you know, go back, check them out. Scribble them somewhere if necessary. And then watch what players try to do with the information mentioned. In our news of bots and so on, we don't have much more until Oral, and probably are not going to spend a lot of time trying to develop a more complex Rose bot because she's not currently been super popular at high level for us to see any really scary tricks that you must be able to counter. She doesn't really seem to be that type of character in the first place.
Round one.
And so far she doesn't seem popular enough at low level for most of the players who play her at low level to have a bunch of weird different styles. So it's probably enough, the rose bot we have now, especially given that it's both complex and does have an option that can be changed, technically 2 of them. If you encounter such a thing and understand how to input bots at all, conceptually, you should be able to set things up so that you get to practice against whatever it is, whatever new trickery that shows up. So we won't necessarily be specifically attempting to make variants in that form, or to come up with an entirely new rose bot, because we haven't seen any entirely new rose strategies that would lead to this being necessary. So keep on looking out for us on the Oro front. In terms of our streams going forward, we are much less likely to have consistent streams other than the Monday one for a while. This is actually a fairly common thing for us, that we take a break around this time. Pre-pandemic, we'd often be streaming and preparing much more with Combo Breaker coming up. And hopefully we'll get to see or experience some of that next year when nearly everyone's vaccinated. As it is one of the few tournaments we definitely try to make it to. If you ever want to hang out, you'll generally find us at Midwest tournaments. Despite none of us living there anymore.
Final round. Fight.
But we usually have a break of about a month after Combo Breaker with much less streaming. And that's unlikely to shift too much because it's also the time of year where we pursue other things for various reasons. You don't have to be a fan of summer per se to enjoy a lot of the shifts in the world that happen around summertime.
And Bison win.
Or to, you know, just not want to go outside because it's hot. So you can find the aforementioned rose bots and bots for other games as well, such as Under Night, Dragon Ball FighterZ, and Dead or Alive, even though we don't really suggest using the Dead or Alive ones because of their system. We did participate in the Guilty Gear Strive beta. It was it's Guilty Gear, but it's Guilty Gear Light. I don't think anyone can fault me for calling it Guilty Gear Light. They've definitely done a bunch of balance changes. They've definitely done a bunch of concept changes in terms of why you would want to do certain things on certain characters, but those are very specific. And we're not likely to buy and play that game as a whole team, so you might not get as much commentary. Of course, there are tons of really great people out there to teach you Guilty Gear, and the style of thing we teach isn't that successful in Guilty Gear, and it's definitely not very much fun to use in Guilty Gear outside of like 2 characters, and not everyone's just going to play those 2 characters. So
Round 1.
we might pop in occasionally with opinions on it for 1 or 2 streams or something. Honestly, I expect that game's going to end up on sale pretty soon relative to most fighting games. And fighting games end up on sale a lot. I can go into a whole dissertation on why the general build of these days of how people market their games works either way, i.e. if you want tournaments, if you want tournament setups, you usually have to buy it full price. You can't wait around as much. And, of course, in new fighting games, if someone feels, I can be good at this game, I'm gonna go and be good at this game. Finally a game where I can be champion or really high rank or something. There is quite a lot that happens when the player believes this. Did Abigail hit the game so hard it broke again? I think that's what happened here. Yep, there we go.
It's go time. Let's do this. Sakura. Necalli.
You can find out what streaming we will be doing at 2_MK_FGC. You can look out for lounges when we still don't intend to stream on the given day, so if you think we might be around playing DOA on a Thursday, check, even if we're not streaming it. Even the same thing goes for Street Fighter. You can look for the lounge, you can probably look for RuneSiren if you think we are probably playing, even if there's no stream up. Guilty Gear is a little harder to do, but we're not really expecting to have the Tuesday Guilty Gear streams at all. And similarly, nothing for Wednesday or Friday. So, basically expect Monday streams most of the time, Thursday streams less than half the time. And our previous less than half the time Tuesday streams expect to be non-existent. You'll obviously hear from us again once Oro is available and Orobot needs to be worked on and released, though that won't necessarily change the stream schedule since we'd be spending time working on Bot. You'd at least get a Friday stream out of it. This period usually lasts until just around the beginning of July.
Round 2.
Maybe a little longer into it depending on what's going on. But we won't be completely out of the loop, so particularly if you're the sort of person who watches this stream, your experience of 2MK is likely to be unaffected. You can pick up any bots at our website 2-mk.org. And if you have anything more specific to either ask about bots or communicate to us with in long form, the contact us page on that website will give you a way to get in contact with us as a whole, whereas the Twitter is much less likely to get checked in the upcoming month. So even if you want something that seems minor, you might want to go through the website instead. We've gotten about the usual amount of feedback on Rosebot, and therefore that's partially factored into not having any changes to make yet. So, enjoy the matches. There may not be a closeout to specifically tell you the stream's ending tonight. You might just cut off in about 20 minutes without anything else said. So if that is the case, good night from Team 2MK, and if it's not, I'll be back in 20 minutes to say it again.
You win. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You lose. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! It's go time. Let's do this. Sakura.
行こう
Necalli.
See you, Dictator.
Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight. Final round. Fight. You lose. Round one. Fight. round. Fight! You lose. Let's do this. Round one. Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! Necalli wins. Round one. Fight! Round 2. Fight! Bison win. Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! Bison win. Let's do this. Round one. Round two. Fight. Bison win. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Bison win.